Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really huge figure, a philosopher whose ideas arguably shaped the 20th century more than any other, but whose legacy is, well, incredibly divisive.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. We're talking about Karl Marx, of course.
Exactly. We're going deep into his life, his world, and the massive body of work.
And we've got a lot to draw on: biographies, economic analysis, political histories. Our mission, really, is to figure out how this one guy writing in the 19th century ended up being so monumentally influential and, frankly, so controversial.
It's about getting past the you-isms, isn't it? Trying to understand the man himself, what drove him, and what the core ideas actually were before they got, filtered through history.
Precisely. And to do that, we can't just jump into his birth in 1818. We need to set the stage. What kind of world was he born into?
Right. Because he steps onto a scene that's already in massive upheaval. The Industrial Revolution is in full...
Well, it had started in England maybe, 50 years earlier?
Yeah.
Around the 1770s, with textiles, steam engines, factories, all that.
Oh, But by the time Marx is a young boy, it's not just an English thing anymore. It's exploding across continent.
Yeah, it's spreading fast. And crucially, it's hitting the Rhineland, the Ruhr region in Germany, right where Marx is growing up in Trier. This area becomes a real industrial powerhouse from the 1820s on.
So imagine that. You're growing up, and the whole pace of life accelerates. New factories are popping up. Cities are growing like crazy. There's this sense of immense...
There's unprecedented growth, incredible new technologies, fortunes being made, societies generating material wealth on a scale never seen before. This is the birth of, modern comfort, modern efficiency.
And this is the absolute key to understanding Marx. There's a huge one. Our sources call it the poison chalice.
That's a good way to put it. Because alongside this explosion of wealth, you have this explosion of human suffering concentrated in the new industrial cities.
We're talking about the urban proletariat, the factory workers. Their lives were, it's hard for us.
It was grinding misery. Think about how they got there. Agricultural reforms were pushing people off the land. They had nowhere to go but these booming, chaotic industrial centers, places like Manchester in England or Aachen, closer to Marx's home.
And suddenly, they're totally dependent on factory wages and the work itself. It's relentless.
The hours were just insane. We're looking at sources mentioning up to 70 hours a week for men.
70 hours?
Yeah. And women and children, kids as young as 8 or 9, they weren't spared. Maybe 55, 60 hours a week for them just to survive. It completely destroyed any sense of traditional life, traditional rhythms.
And life outside the factory wasn't any better, was it?
No, definitely not. They were crammed into these awful tenements, poor sanitation, no clean water, terrible ventilation. Disease was rampant.
Cholera especially, right? The Blue Death, they called it.
Exact. These waves of cholera epidemics swept through industrial Europe again and again from the 1830s right up into the 1890s. Imagine living with that constant threat on top of everything else, just surrounded by squalor and death.
So this is the backdrop, this stark contrast, immense wealth creation on one side, and this deep grinding poverty and suffering for the people actually creating it on the other. Can't understand Marx without seeing that tension.
Absolutely. His whole life's work is, in many ways, a direct, almost visceral reaction to that reality, that observable, unavoidable misery.
Okay, so given that context, you might think the guy who comes up with the ideology to overthrow this whole system would have, risen from the factory floor himself.
Well, you'd expect a background in the proletariat.
But that's not Karl Marx at all. Which brings us to our first sect, the affluent start and the radical. He was born May 5th, 1818, in Trier, Western Germany. And his family... definitely not working class.
No, far from it. They were solidly upper middle class. His father was a successful lawyer. They lived in a nice big house. Sources mention a 10-room townhouse. They were part of the professional elite, benefiting from the opportunities of the time.
And there's a really interesting detail about his father, Heinrich Marx. His background wasn't originally Lutheran, which was the family's religion when Karl was born.
No, that's right. Heinrich's original name was Herschel Levi. He came from a very long line of Jewish rabbis, actually. His own father was a rabbi in Trier.
So why the conversion to Lutheran Christianity?
Well, it happened right around the time Karl was born. And the sources suggest it wasn't really about religious conviction. It was a pragmatic move. Anti-Semitism was on the rise across Europe, and particularly in Prussia, there were increasing legal and professional restrictions on Jews.
So converting was basically a way to protect his career as a lawyer and his family's social...
Exactly. It was about navigating the political realities of the time. But despite that formal conversion, the atmosphere in the Marx household wasn't particularly religious.
No, it sounds like it was very secular, very rationalist, heavily influenced by the Enlightenment ideas about reason, progress, progress, skepticism towards dogma.
That intellectual climate is really important. It grounds Marx's later thinking, his attempt to create a kind of scientific analysis of history and economics.
And his education seems to reflect a bit of that challenging spirit, too, doesn't it?
It does. He was homeschooled for a while, but then he went to a secondary school run by a guy named Hugh Wittenbach. And Wittenbach was known for being a bit of a radical, a liberal thinker.
To the point where the Prussian authorities actually got involved.
Yeah, the sources say the government stepped in because they thought the curriculum was too critical of the established order. They basically forced the school to tone it down. So even as a teenager, Marx is seeing this direct clash between challenging ideas and state power.
Interesting. So then he goes off to university in 1835, University of Bonn initially, supposedly to study law, like his father.
Supposedly being the operative word, it seems like he was more interested in philosophy and maybe the less academic side of student life. Mm-hmm. He joined student societies like the Trier Tavern Club, ran up some debts, typical student stuff maybe.
Perhaps. His father wasn't too pleased, though.
No, Heinrich pushed him to transfer to the University of Berlin in 1836, which was seen as much more serious, much more intellectually rigorous. And that move turned out to be absolutely pivotal.
Because of Hegel.
Precisely. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel had died just a few years earlier, but his philosophy completely dominated Berlin's intellectual scene. Marx just dives right into Hegel's thought.
And he falls in with a particular group, the young Hegelians.
Right. Now, Hegel himself was actually quite conservative politically, but his philosophical method, the dialectic, this idea of history moving through contradiction, was seen by younger thinkers as potentially revolutionary.
So the young Hegelians took Hegel's tools and turned them against the system.
Exact. They were radical. They used Hegelian ideas to critique the Prussian government, to argue for more freedom, to challenge religious orthodoxy. This is where Marx really finds his intellectual home and his political voice starts to form. He becomes deeply critical of the status quo.
But then tragedy strikes in 1838.
Yes, his father Heinrich dies. And even though they'd had their disagreements, especially over Marx's studies and spending, they were reportedly quite close. His death was a huge emotional blow.
And a financial one too, right?
A big one. Heinrich had been the main breadwinner, and his death left the large Marx family in a pretty precarious financial situation. This probably solidified Marx's need to find a way to earn a living, likely through writing.
So he finishes his studies, getting his doctorate in 1841 from the University of Jena. What was his dissertation?
It was titled The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature. So he's digging into ancient Greek materialist philosophers. It shows his philosophical depth.
But an academic career wasn't really on the cards for him, was it?
No chance. By this point, he's too associated with the young Hegelians, who were under surveillance by the Prussian authorities. Universities were state-controlled, and they weren't about to hire known radicals.
So the path of a quiet academic is closed. He has to find another way.
Right. He turns to journalism, to political writing, and that immediately puts him on a collision course with the censors. It's the start of a very unstable, very nomadic period of his life.
Okay, so section 2, the itinerant writer and the crucial partnership. Marx can't be an academic in Prussia, so he becomes a political writer. How does that?
About as well as you'd expect in autocratic Prussia. He quickly runs afoul of the press censorship laws. His writings are seen as inflammatory, dangerous.
So he has to leave?
He does. This kicks off about 6 years of constant movement, basically being kicked out of one place after another. It really defines his late 20s and early 30s.
Where does he go first?
He leaves Prussia in 1843 and heads to Paris. Paris was seen as a center of radical thought, a bit freer.
But that doesn't last long.
No. The Prussian government actually puts pressure on the French. They see Marx as a troublemaker, and in 1845, he gets expelled from Paris.
Wow. So we're next.
Belgium was relatively liberal at the time, but again, his political activities attract attention. He's accused of subversive activity, and in 1848, with revolutions breaking out across Europe, he's expelled from Brussels too.
It's relentless.
It is. He briefly goes back to Cologne in Germany during the revolutionary chaos of 1848, tries to get involved, but the Prussians are cracking down hard. So he faces arrest again.
So that leads to the final move.
Yes. In 1849, he makes the decision to move to London, and this time it's permanent. He'll live there for the rest of.
Why London? What made it different?
Primarily its relative political freedom. Britain had much more liberal press laws compared to most of continental Europe. You could publish things in London, even radical things that would get you immediately arrested elsewhere. It was a kind of sanctuary for political exile.
But life in London wasn't exactly easy street for him, was it? Especially his domestic.
No, it was incredibly difficult. Utter chaos, really. He'd married Jenny von Westphalen back in 1843. She was actually from a minor aristocratic family, 4 years older than him.
And her family wasn't thrilled about the match.
Not at all. They saw Marx as this sort of penniless, bohemian, radical writer. Not exactly the ideal son-in-law for Prussian nobility, even minor nobility. It caused quite a stir.
It's full of contradictions, isn't it? Like his relationship with Jenny's brother.
Oh yeah, Ferdinand von Westphalen. While Marx is writing critiques of the Prussian state, Ferdinand actually becomes the Prussian Minister of the Interior. He's overseeing the very conservative policies Marx is railing against.
And yet they apparently stayed on relatively good terms.
Seems so. It's one of those strange biographical quirk. But maybe it speaks to the complexities of personal relationships versus political ideology.
But their day-to-day life in London was defined by poverty, wasn't it?
Extreme poverty for a long stretch. They were never financially comfortable. Sources describe them living for years in a tiny two-room apartment in Soho. Marx was constantly dodging creditors, sometimes having to use fake names just to rent a place.
And this instability had tragic consequences.
It really did. They had 7 children together, but 4 of them died in infancy or early childhood. Now, infant mortality rates were higher back then generally, but this was still a devastatingly high number. It speaks volumes about the squalor and stress they were living under.
It paints a picture of Marx prioritizing his revolutionary work, perhaps, over the immediate well-being of his family.
That's certainly a criticism, that he was so consumed by his research and writing that he neglected their material needs. Yet at the same time, accounts also describe him as a very loving, doting father when he was present.
And the daughters who survived clearly inherited his political passion.
Absolutely. Jenny, Laura, and Eleanor all became significant political figures in their own right, activists, writers, translators, deeply involved in the socialist movements that grew after his death.
But none of this, the survival, the writing, the research, would have been possible without one figure.
No, we have to talk about Friedrich Engels. This partnership is absolutely central.
And talk about contradictions. Engels came from the complete opposite background to Marx, didn't he?
Totally different world. Engels was about 2.5 years younger. His family was incredibly wealthy. They owned large textile factories, both in Barmen, Germany, and crucially in Salford, near Manchester in England.
So Engels is literally the son of the industrial capitalism that Marx wants.
He is. The great irony is the man bankrolling the critique of capitalism is a capitalist himself, or at least from a capitalist family.
But Engels wasn't just a rich kid playing at Revolution, was he?
Not at all. Even from a young age, Engels was deeply critical of the system that generated his family's wealth. He saw the conditions in Manchester firsthand.
He wrote about it, didn't he? That famous book.
Yes, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845. It's a searing, incredibly detailed account of the horrific poverty and exploitation in the heart of industrial England. It's a major work in its own right. Engels wasn't just Marx's sidekick. He was a serious thinker and writer.
They met and bonded over their shared view.
They first met briefly in 1842, but really connected properly in Paris in 1844. They found they had an almost identical critique of society and philosophy. It was an intellectual meeting of minds that lasted a lifetime.
And crucially, Engels provided the money.
He was the lifeline. Marx was brilliant, but hopeless with money and consistently broke. Engels, using funds from his family business, sometimes discreetly provided Marx with a regular income. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to allow Marx to survive in London and, critically, to spend years doing unpaid research in the British Museum.
So no Engels, probably no Das Kapital.
It's hard to imagine how Marx could have completed it otherwise. And Engels' contribution didn't stop there. After Marx died, it was Engels who painstakingly edited and published the massive, unfinished manuscripts of volumes 2 and 3 of Capital.
Incredible. So while Marx is struggling financially but being propped up by Engels, they're also trying to organize politically, right?
Yes, they weren't just theorists, they were activists. They realized early on that isolated radicals wouldn't achieve much. They needed coordination.
Which led to things like the Communist Correspondence.
Exact. Set up around 1846 in places like Brussels, London, Paris. The idea was to create a network for communists across Europe to share ideas, debate strategy, and coordinate actions quickly and often secretly.
And why the term communist? It was quite provocative even then.
Deliberately so. The term communism became popular in radical circles in the 1830s and 40s. It signaled a connection to the most radical traditions of the French Revolution. People like Babeuf, the left-wing Jacobins, the Sans-Culottes, the working-class revolutionaries. It meant a complete overhaul of society, not just reform.
And this committee eventually evolved.
Yes. In 1847, it merged with another group called the League of the Just, which was mostly German immigrant workers. Together, they formed the Communist League.
And the Communist League wanted something tangible, didn't they? A statement of principle.
They did. They needed a clear, concise declaration of their aims and beliefs, and they commissioned Marx and Engels to write it.
Which brings us, of course, to Section 3, the Communist Manifesto and the Revolutions of 1848. So the Communist League asks Marx and Engels for a manifesto. How did that actually come together?
Well, given how incredibly famous and influential the manifesto became, the actual writing process was
Yeah.
remarkably chaotic.
Really? You'd think it'd be meticulously planned.
Far from it. Marx especially was a terrible procrastinator. The League commissioned it in late 1847, but by January 1848, he hadn't produced much. Instead, he was off traveling, setting up a League branch in Ghent.
Doing what in Ghent?
Well, some sources suggest a good chunk of that week and a half was spent, let's say, enjoying the local hospitality. There are reports he was heavily intoxicated from it.
So one of history's most important political tech might have been partially fueled by Belgian beer.
It's certainly plausible. And it fits a pattern. Marx seemed to have had issues with heavy drinking wine, liquor, and cigars throughout his life. It likely contributed to his later health problems, maybe liver issues, even though he was only 30.
So how did the Manifesto actually get finished?
The Communist League leadership in London basically got fed up waiting. In late January 1848, they sent Marx an ultimatum. Get the manuscript to us by February 1st, or else.
Or else what?
Or they demand the return of the documents they'd given him and find someone else. So under pressure, Marx basically locked himself away and hammered out the final text in early February.
Wow. Talk about working to a deadline.
Absolutely. It was published in London later that month. And although Engels is credited as co-author, and he certainly contributed ideas and maybe some drafts, the final powerful polemical voice is overwhelmingly Marx's.
And it's surprisingly short, isn't it, for something so impactful?
Very short. Only about 14,000 words. It's not a dense philosophical treatise like Capital. It's designed to be read, understood, and acted upon. It's a call to arms.
Okay, so what are the core arguments packed in pages? What's the central message?
The absolute bedrock is the opening line, effective. History is class struggle. Marx just sweeps away all previous ways of looking at the past.
Forget kings and queens, forget religions, forget nations.
Right. For Marx, the real engine driving history is the conflict between economic class, those who own the means of production and those who don't, the oppressors and the oppressed.
And he traces this through history.
Yeah, he gives examples. In ancient Rome, it was patricians versus plebeians and slaves. In the Middle Ages, it was feudal lords versus serfs.
And now, in the industrial age?
Now it's the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Bourgeoisie are the owners of the new factories, the banks, the capital. The proletariat are the industrial working class who own nothing but their ability to sell their labor.
And he's particularly scathing about the bourgeoisie.
Oh, incredibly so. He credits them with revolutionizing production, creating immense wealth. But he argues they've done it by destroying all traditional social.
That famous quote about the
The
family.
bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money. Everything becomes about profit, about cash. Human relationships are secondary.
And he hits hard on things like child labor.
He saw it as the inevitable, brutal consequence of a system demanding cheap labor to maximize profit. The family itself becomes just another economic unit, forced to put its children to work.
So if that's the problem, what's the solution offered in the Manifesto?
It's radical and unambiguous. The abolition of private property, not personal belongings, but private ownership of the means of production.
So factories, land, banks?
All of it. It should be transferred to communal state ownership. The state, representing the workers, would then manage the economy for the benefit of all, improving working conditions, expanding education, distributing the wealth fairly.
And it all builds to that incredibly famous closing line.
The slogan adopted from the League. Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chain. It's pure revolutionary rhetoric. Powerful.
And the timing of its publication couldn't have been more dramatic, could it?
Absolutely uncanny. It hits the streets in London in late February 1848, just as Europe is exploding.
The springtime of the people.
Exactly. Revolutions are breaking out everywhere, starting in Palermo in January, Paris in February, then Vienna, Berlin, Budapest. It seemed like the Manifesto was describing a reality that was unfolding right then and there.
Did Marx get involved in these revolutions?
He tried. He rushed back to Cologne in Germany, using some funds from Engels to start a radical newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. He threw himself into the revolutionary activity there, leveraging his role in the Communist League.
But the revolutions ultimately failed, eh?
They did, for the most part. The old powers regrouped and cracked down hard. And Marx's activities in Cologne quickly attracted the attention of the Prussian authorities again.
So, more trouble?
Yes. Harassment, censorship of his newspaper, and eventually the threat of arrest forced him to flee Germany once more in May 1849.
And that's when he heads to London for good.
That's right. He realized continental Europe was just too dangerous, too unstable for him to continue his work. London offered the only refuge where he could research, write, and publish with relative freedom.
So Marx lands in London in 1849. Essentially, a political ref broke. With this kicks off the next major phase. Section 4, the London Years, and the magnum opus, Das Kapital. How did he even survive?
It was incredibly tough. Those early years in London were marked by extreme poverty and hardship, as we mentioned. His main source of somewhat regular income for a while was journalism.
Right. You said he wrote for an American newspaper?
Yes, the New York Daily Tribune. He became their London correspondent, basically interpreting British politics and European events for an American audience. It was quite a prominent paper at the time.
Was it enough to live on?
Not really, no.
Yeah.
It was precarious. He was paid per article and only for the ones they actually published. So the income was very unstable, very unpredictable, constantly scrambling.
Which again underlines the importance of Engels' work.
Absolutely critical. Engels' regular financial contributions, often sent discreetly, were what kept Marx and his family afloat during the long years it took to research and write Das Kapital. Without Engels, Marx would almost certainly have had to abandon his theoretical work and get some kind of regular job.
It's fascinating that his journalism touched on major world events, too, like the American Civil War.
Oh, yes. He followed American politics closely, and he was vehemently anti-slavery. He saw the Civil War as a pivotal struggle, not just for America, but for the future of labor globally. He was firmly on the side of the Union.
And wrote extensively about it.
He did. For the Tribune, and also for Die Press, a newspaper in Vienna. He analyzed the economic roots of the conflicts of the class dynamics involved.
But didn't his strong stance cause problems with the Tribune?
It did. Eventually, in 1863, the Tribune's editorial line shifted towards a more neutral position, possibly open to some kind of compromise that might have preserved slavery in certain areas to end the war faster.
And Marx wouldn't accept that.
No. He was uncompromising on abolition. Whether he resigned in protest or was effectively let go because his views no longer aligned with the papers isn't perfectly clear, but his relationship with the Tribune ended around that.
Which, ironically, maybe freed him up more for his main project.
Possibly. It certainly removed a source of income, making Engels' support even more vital. But yes, it meant more time dedicated to the monumental task he'd set himself, writing Das Kapital, Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, Capital, a critique of political economy.
His magnum opus. And this was based on years and years of research.
Decades, really. His primary workplace became the famous reading room at the British Museum, now the British Library. He would go there day after day, year after year, devouring mountains of books, economic reports, government statistics, parliamentary papers, historical accounts, anything he could get his hands on related to economics and history.
The scale of the work is just immense, isn't it?
It's staggering. Volume 1, the only part published during his lifetime, came out in 1867. And that alone is a dense, complex book, maybe 500, 600 pages, depending on the edition.
But that wasn't the end of it.
Not even close. Marx continued researching and writing, accumulating vast amounts of notes and manuscript drafts for subsequent volumes. But he struggled to finish, constantly revising, always finding more to read.
So it fell to Engels again after Marx died.
Yes. Engels inherited this mountain of often chaotic, hard-to-decipher notes. It took him years of dedicated effort to edit and compile them into Volume 2, published in 1885, and Volume 3 in 1890. Altogether, the 3 volumes of Das Kapital run to well over 1 million words. It's a beast of a work.
Okay, so given we can't possibly cover 1 million words in detail, let's focus on the core philosophical ideas underpinning it all. You mentioned 2 key pillars earlier. The first was historical material.
Right. We touched on this with the Manifesto, but Capital develops it much more rigorously. HM is Marx's fundamental theory of history. It argues that the primary engine of historical change isn't ideas or politics or great leaders, but material conditions. Specifically, the way societies organize economic production.
The base and superstructure idea?
Exactly. The economic base, the forces of production, technology, resources, and the relations of production, how people are organized, like owners and workers or lords and serfs, determines the superstructure.
And the superstructure is?
Everything else. Law, politics, religion, culture, art, philosophy. Marx argued these things aren't independent forces. They grow out of and ultimately serve to justify and maintain the underlying economic system, change the economic base, and eventually the superstructure will have to.
So historical events are driven by conflicts rooted in economics.
Yes, specifically conflict between economic classes with opposing interests. Feudalism gives way to capitalism, not because of new political ideas, but because new technologies and ways of organizing trade create a new class, the bourgeoisie, whose interests clash with the old feudal aristocracy. That economic conflict drives the political and social change.
As you said, this was a revolutionary way to look at history back then.
Absolutely. Historians focused on kings, battles, treaties. Marx said, no, look at the economic. Look at who controls the means of production. Look at technology. Look at class relations. That's where the real act.
And even if people disagree with his political conclusions, that emphasis on economic factors has had a huge impact on how history is studied today, hasn't it?
Undeniable. Modern historical analysis, sociology, economics, they all owe a debt to Marx for highlighting the crucial role of material conditions and class conflict, even if they reject his specific theories or predictions.
Okay, so that's historical materialism. What about the second pillar? The Marxist dialectic, or dialectic sounds more.
It is, and it's definitely more complex, maybe even more controversial. It's Marx's attempt to combine Hegel's dialectical method with his own materialist view of the world.
So Hegel's dialectic was about ideas, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, a clash of concepts leading to a new, higher.
Correct. For Hegel, history was the unfolding of spirit or idea through this dialectical process. Marx famously said he wanted to turn Hegel right side up. He argued the dialectic doesn't happen in the realm of abstract thought. It happens in the real material world.
How does that work? What's a material dialectic?
Marx essentially rejected the idea that individual consciousness or perception is primary, sort of Cartesian, I think, therefore I am idea. He said, no, the physical material world, nature, society, our economic activity exists independently of our mind. And that material reality itself contains contradictions, tensions.
So instead of a clash of ideas, it's a clash of material forces.
Exactly. Economic systems like capitalism contain inherent contradictions. For example, capitalism, the thesis, drives towards ever-increasing production and efficiency. But to maximize profit, it also seeks to minimize wages paid to workers, the antithesis.
So you have this massive capacity to produce goods, but the workers who produce them can't afford to buy them all back.
Precisely. That's a fundamental material contradiction within the system itself. That tension, that conflict between the forces of production and the relations of production builds and builds until it forces a change, a revolution, leading to a new system, the synthesis, which in Marx's view would be communism.
So the dialectic isn't just a way of thinking, it's the actual process by which real reality.
That's the core idea of dialectical materialism. It's about how real-world contradictions drive historical development, but it's also where some of the biggest criticisms of Marx come in.
Because it seems to downplay the role of the individual.
Yes. By focusing so heavily on these large-scale material forces and economic groups like the proletariat or the bourgeoisie, critics argue DM can tend to trivialize individual agency, individual consciousness, and ultimately individual rights and value. The group and the historical process become more important than the person.
Which obviously has huge implications when you think about how these ideas were later put into practice. But before we get to the legacy, there are a couple more key concepts from Capital we should touch on, which really get to the human cost of the system Marx was analyzing. The idea of alienation.
Right. Alienation is crucial. It's Marx's way of describing the psychological and social damage inflicted on workers by the capitalist mode of production. It's not just about being poor. It's about being fundamentally disconnected, estranged.
Estranged from what? He identified specific types of alienation, didn't he?
He did. 4 main types. First, the worker is alienated from the product of their labor. Unlike a traditional craftsperson who makes a whole object and feels connected to it, the factory worker makes only one tiny part of something they'll likely never own or even see completed. The product becomes something foreign, hostile even.
Okay, what's the second?
Alienation from the act of production itself. Work isn't a fulfilling creative activity. It's forced, repetitive, monotonous drudgery controlled by the pace of the machine or the demands of the boss. It's just a means to an end survival, not an end in itself. You feel like a cog in a machine.
Makes sense.
Third, alienation from fellow workers. Instead of collaboration and community, capitalism often pits workers against each other, competing for jobs, for wages, fearing replacement. The system fosters antagonism rather than solidarity.
And the fourth type sounds the most profound.
It is. Alienation from our human nature, or what Marx called our species being, cutting ways. He believed humans are naturally creative, social beings who find fulfillment in purposeful work and interact. Capitalism, he argued, strips this away, reducing us to isolated individuals focused only on basic survival, denying our potential for free, conscious activity. We become less than fully human.
So alienation captures the deep dehumanizing effect he saw in industrial labor. But how did he explain the economic mechanism behind the exploitation? That brings us to surplus value, right?
Exact. Surplus value is the economic engine of Das Kapital. It's Marx's attempt to mathematically explain how capitalists make profit and why he considered it inherently exploitative.
It's based on his labor theory of value, isn't it? The idea that the value of something comes from the labor put in.
Yes. Building on classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, Marx argues the value of a commodity is determined by the average amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it.
Okay, so if value comes from labor, how does the capitalist, who doesn't necessarily labor in the same way, end up with profit?
This is the core of the surplus value argument. The capitalist buys the only commodity the worker has to sell, their labor power, their ability to work for a certain time. The capitalist pays the worker a wage. What does that wage represent?
Enough for the worker to live on. Food, shelter, basic needs, so they can come back home.
Right. The wage covers the cost of reproducing the worker's labor power. Let's say it takes 4 hours of work for the worker to produce enough value to cover their daily wage. Marx called this necessary labor time.
But the capitalist doesn't just make them work hours.
No. The capitalist has bought their labor power for the whole day, say, 10 hours. So after the worker has worked the 4 hours needed to cover their own wage, they keep working for the remaining 6 hours.
And the value produced in those extra 6 hours?
That value, produced during the surplus labor time, belongs entirely to the capital. That is the surplus value. It's unpaid labor extracted from the worker.
So profit doesn't come from selling things at a markup, according to Marx. It comes from paying workers less than the total value.
Precisely. The capitalist extracts this surplus value, which is the source of profit, rent, and interest. For Marx, this extraction is exploitation by definition, even if the wage seems fair or the working conditions are okay. The system is built on extracting unpaid labor time. That's the fundamental economic critique at the heart of capital.
Okay, so Marx has developed this incredibly detailed critique of capitalism in Das Kapital, rooted in historical materialism, dialectical materialism, alienation, and surplus value. But he wasn't just an armchair theorist, was he? He was actively involved in trying to organize the working class.
Absolutely. He always saw theory and practice, which brings us to Section 5, Political Action and Legacy Shadow. A key development here was the first international.
The International Working Mention, formed in 1804. What was the goal?
It emerged from a growing sense among labor activists across Europe. They needed to cooperate internationally. National trade unions or socialist groups acting alone were too easily suppressed or played off against each other by capitalists and government. An issue like supporting Polish workers rising up against Russia in 1863 highlighted the need for cross-border solidarity.
And Marx was central to this.
Very much so. He was involved from the beginning, drafting many of its key foundational documents and guiding its political direction from London. The International aimed to be an umbrella organization for various left-wing groups, trade unionists, socialists, communists, anarchists, primarily across Europe.
But bringing all those different fashions together sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
The First International became a real ideological battleground almost immediately, especially between the faction broadly aligned with Marx and his vision of communism and the anarchist wing.
Led by
the charismatic Russian revolutionary, Mikhail Bakunin. He and Marx had a fierce personal and political rivalry.
What was the fundamental disagreement? It wasn't just personality, surely.
No, it was deep philosophical differences about the state and revolution. Marx believed that after the proletariat seized power, they would need to use the existing state machinery temporarily to suppress counter-revolutionaries and transition society towards communism. This phase he called the dictatorship of the proletariat.
So use the state to smash the state, essentially.
In a way, yes. Use centralized power to dismantle the structures of capitalist power and private property. Only after class distinctions had withered away would the state itself become unnecessary and wither away.
But Bakunin and the anarchists totally rejected that idea.
Completely. For Bakunin, all forms of state power were inherently oppressive and corrupting, regardless of who wielded it. He argued that creating a workers' state would just lead to a new form of tyranny, a new ruling class of bureaucrats and officials.
So they wanted to abolish the state immediately upon revolution.
Yes, smash the state entirely, along with Cap, and replace it with a decentralized federation of free communes and worker associations. No central authority at all.
Two fundamentally incompatible visions for the...
Absolutely. Marx saw anarchism as naive, utopian, and politically ineffective, unable to defend a revolution. Bakunin saw Marxism as inherently authoritarian, a recipe for despotism. This clash tore the international.
How did it end?
The final split came at the Hague Congress in 1872. Marx managed to get Bakunin and his followers expelled, but the infighting had fatally weakened the organization. It effectively collapsed shortly after.
Despite the international failing, Marx continued to analyze revolutionary moments using his historical framework.
Yes, he was constantly applying his theories to real events. He wrote extensively about the original French Revolution of 1789, seeing it as the classic example of the bourgeoisie overthrowing the feudal aristocracy.
And he contrasted that with the failures of 1848.
He did. He argued that in 1848, the bourgeoisie got scared of the radicalism of the proletariat they had initially allied. So they betrayed the revolution, compromised with the old powers, and allowed figures like Napoleon III in France to take over, halting any move towards genuine social transformation.
Then there's his analysis of a later French event, Paris Commune, in 1871.
Right. This was a really significant moment for Marx. After France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, radical workers and political groups seized control of Paris and ran the city for about 2.5
before being brutally crushed.
Yes. The French national government besieged Paris and then retook the city with extreme violence. Thousands of communards were executed. Estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 deaths. A real bloodbath.
How did Marx react to the Commune?
He wrote about it immediately afterwards in a pamphlet called The Civil War in France.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fascinating piece because while praising the heroism of the communards, his description of Paris under their rule is, well, highly idealized.
How so?
He portrays commune-run Paris as this near-perfect model of proletarian democracy, a place of peace, order, Almost no crime, where the police had vanished and all the corrupting influences of the old regime were swept away.
Which sounds maybe a bit optimistic, given it was a city under siege after a war run by competing radical factions.
Exactly. It reflects a tendency you see sometimes in Marx, incredibly sharp critical analysis of the existing capitalist system, but then a much more romantic, almost utopian view of what revolutionary alternatives look like in practice, even amidst violence and chaos. He saw the commune as the first glimpse of the dictatorship of the proletariat in action.
As Marx got older, though, his own health started to decline quite seriously.
It really did. Particularly after he turned 60 in 1878. He'd never been robust. He was actually excused from mandatory military service back in Prussia in the late 1830s due to some kind of chest ailment, possibly pleurisy.
And his lifestyle probably...
Definitely not. Decades of poor diet, heavy smoking, alcohol consumption, chronic overwork, stress, and insomnia, for which he sometimes took opiates, all took their toll. He suffered from recurring boils, liver problems, bronchitis.
And then he suffered personal losses, too.
Yes. His wife, Jenny, his lifelong partner through all the hardship, died of cancer in December 1881. That was a devastating blow. His own health worsened significantly after that. He developed severe catarrh, a persistent inflammation of his airways.
And he died not long after.
Just over a year later, Karl Marx died in London on March 14, 1883, at the age of 64. He was sitting in his armchair, having suffered a pulmonary hemorrhage. He was essentially stateless and nearly penniless at the end.
What was his funeral like? Was there a big outpouring?
Surprisingly small, really. A very modest affair at Highgate Cemetery in London. Engels gave the main eulogy, but only about 11 or 12 other people attended, mostly family members and a few close political associates. No grand pronouncements, no state recognition, just a quiet burial for a controversial skull.
It's incredible to contrast that quiet end with the monumental, world-shaking legacy his ideas would unleash.
It truly is. The seeds he planted were already beginning to sprout, but the scale of what was to come was completely unforeseen at the time of his death.
And that brings us to the legacy itself, which is complex right from the start. Because even as Marx was insisting on the need for total revolution, things were actually changing, weren't they? Incrementally.
Yes, that's a crucial point. While Marx was deep in research in the British Museum, the real world wasn't standing still. The conditions he described in the 1840s were slowly, gradually improving in places like Britain.
Through things like labor laws.
Exactly. Like the 10 Hours Act in Britain, passed back in 1847, which limited the working hours for women and children in factories. By 1848, it effectively meant a 58-hour week. Other factory acts followed, regulating safety, sanitation, child labor.
And workers themselves were organizing.
Trade unions were growing in strength, using collective bargaining to win better wages and conditions. These were the kinds of gradual reforms, what we might broadly call socialism or social democracy, that Marx generally dismissed.
Why did he dismiss them? Weren't they improving workers' lives?
He saw them as mere tink, as sops thrown by the bourgeoisie to pacify the working class and delay the inevitable revolution. He believed the fundamental exploitative nature of capitalism remained untouched by these reforms. Only a complete overthrow of the system and the abolition of private property would suffice. He wanted radical overhaul, not just reform.
But then the revolutions that did happen in his name often occurred in places he wouldn't have predicted, which leads to the Russia paradox.
Right. According to classical Marxist theory, communist revolution should happen after a country has fully developed industrial capital. You need a large, organized, class-conscious proletariat forged in the factories to lead the charge. Marx expected the revolution in Britain or Germany or maybe France.
Not an agrarian, largely feudal, autocratic Russia.
Exactly. Russia in the late 19th century barely had an industrial work. It seemed like the least likely place for a Marxist revolution.
Yet Marx himself seemed to contemplate this possibility.
He did, interestingly. Towards the end of his life, in 1881, he corresponded with a Russian revolutionary named Era Zasulik. She basically asked him, could Russia, with its traditional peasant communes, the Mir, potentially bypass the capitalist stage and move directly towards communism?
What did Marx say? Did he give a clear answer?
His reply was cautious, nuanced, and ultimately somewhat ambiguous. He didn't rule it out entirely. He acknowledged the unique potential of the Russian commune, but stressed it would need support from proletarian revolutions in the industrialized West to succeed.
But the fact that he even considered it
was hugely significant later on. It provided a theoretical loophole, a justification, for Russian Marxists like Lenin and the Bolsheviks. They argued that Marx himself saw Russia as a special case, allowing them to claim Marxist legitimacy for seizing power in a predominantly agrarian country in 1917, even though it contradicted the standard theory.
Which brings us right to the heart of the final reckoning. Intent versus outcome. There seems little doubt about Marx's intentions, right?
No, the sources are clear. He was genuinely horrified by the poverty, exploitation, and dehumanization he saw under industrial capitalism. He sincerely believed his ideas would lead to a better world, a communist society where everyone would live in comfort, dignity, and freedom from exploitation. His goal was utopian.
But the historical reality of regimes established in his name in the 20th century, the Soviet Union, China, Cambodia, and others, was often the opposite. Authoritarianism, state terror, mass famine, the suppression of liberty.
Exactly. And this is the central, unavoidable controversy surrounding Marx. By the peak of the Cold War, something like a third to a half of the world's population lived under governments claiming to be Marxist-Lenin, and the human cost in many of those places was astronomical.
So the crucial question is, was there something inherent in Marx's ideas that made these terrible outcomes likely or even inevitable? Or were his ideas simply twisted and abused by ruthless dictators who just used Marxism?
That's the debate. Critics argue that the core flaw lies in the demand for the abolition of private property. How do you actually achieve that on a societal scale?
It seems impossible without massive coercion.
Right. Taking away property rights that people believe are theirs, farms, businesses, homes, inevitably requires the use of force by a powerful, centralized state, especially if there's resistance. The argument is that the very act of implementing this core Marxist goal necessitates an authoritarian state apparatus.
And because many of these revolutions happened in countries that already had long histories of autocracy, like Tsarist Russia,
the new revolutionary regime simply slipped into those old patterns of centralized control, repression, and disregard for individual rights. But now they wielded total control over the economy as well, justified by Marxist ideology. The state became all-powerful, leading to disasters like Stalin's purges or Mao's Great Leap Forward, where tens of millions died.
So one view is that the blueprint itself contained the seeds of tyranny.
That's the argument, that the rejection of private property and the need for a dictatorship of the proletariat inevitably leads down a dark path, regardless of Marx's original utopian intent.
But the alternative view?
The alternative is that Marx was fundamentally a humanist, reacting to the specific horrors of 19th century capitalism. His critiques of exploitation and alienation remain powerful. The regimes that claimed his name in the 20th century, particularly in non-industrialized countries led by figures like Lenin, Stalin, or Mao, fundamentally distorted his ideas, creating totalitarian systems he himself would have rejected. They cherry-picked his writings to justify their own power grab.
So was he the well-meaning prophet whose message was corrupted, or the unwitting architect of systems that caused unimaginable suffering?
That remains the central, haunting question about Karl Marx. There's no easy answer.
It really is a profound story to unpack. We've traced the life of this incredibly influential thinker born into relative comfort, educated in philosophy, yet dedicating his entire life, often in poverty and exile, to analyzing and ultimately calling for the destruction of the industrial capitalist.
A system that, ironically, through the support of Engels, actually enabled him to do that work. It's just layers upon layers of contradiction. He built this vast intellectual system, rooted entirely in the material world, economics, labor, class struggle, yet aiming for what seems like an almost immaterial, like a stateless, classless utopia.
And if we boil down his core intellectual contribution, those two pillars really stand out.
I think so. Historical materialism gave us a completely new way to analyze history, forcing us to see the profound impact of economic structures and class conflict on everything else. Whether you agree with the conclusions or not, it changed the way we study the past.
And dialectical materialism.
More complex, more controversial, but its focus on material contradiction driving change, and its emphasis on the collective economic group, the class or the individual, laid the philosophical groundwork for political movements that prioritize the revolutionary process, sometimes tragically, over individual rights and freedom.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to chew on, something that sits right at the heart of this whole.
We know Marx was deeply, genuinely appalled by the suffering caused by early industrial capitalism, but we also know that in the decades after his death, gradual incremental changes, labor laws, trade unions, collective bargaining, things he largely dismissed, did significantly improve the lives of working people in many capitalist countries without violent revolution.
So the question, did the 20th century often violent represent a fun sap or the private property?